Hey y'all, Matt here, and today we're going to continue to talk about Jesus and the resurrection. We've talked a lot about the Gospels. We talked about the historical Jesus, how we know that Jesus is a historical person even in secular history. And now we're going to talk about some of the evidences of how we can actually support the fact that the resurrection really happened. And before we get into this video, I just want to remind you, if you like these, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. And you can even turn on notifications. That way YouTube will actually notify you when I post a new video. Typically we're trying to do Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, so tune in on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for new content, hopefully. But like I said, in the historical Jesus video, we talked about how secular history even confirms that Jesus Christ was a real person. It basically affirms what the Gospels say, that he was a real man who walked the earth. He had a ministry. He had disciples that followed him. He was crucified by the Romans under Pilate. And then his disciples claimed that he rose from the dead and overcame sin and death, and that began the Christian movement that we see in the book of Acts. But there's so much antagonism towards the resurrection of the dead, because sometimes it can be kind of hard to believe. Somebody being resurrected from the dead isn't something that we see every single day. And so today, this isn't going to be an all-inclusive list. We don't have time to go into all of that, but we're going to talk about 5 things that help support that the resurrection really happened. And these are simple things too. They're not really complex or hard to understand. The first one is what we consider to be history. Typically in the ancient times, if we have one or two sources on something, we have one that actually tells about it, and then we have a second one that confirms it. That is enough credibility for us to call that history. And we have far more than that when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus. We not only have 4 sources in the 4 Gospels, and we talked about those in a previous video I'll link in the description, but we also have the affirmation of this in the epistles that Paul wrote, or the letters that Paul wrote, where he actually talks about how his perspective of Jesus is the same as the disciples. He's teaching the same thing, and he also affirms that the resurrection of Christ actually happened. And he actually goes further, and he says that without the resurrection, our faith is worthless. Then we have the creed that developed in the early church. As the church formed in Acts, we see believers start to come. They plant churches, and this is where they had to try to figure out a way to very quickly sum up what they believe, the core of their beliefs. And we see the resurrection of Jesus put into that creed very, very early in the church history. In addition to that, Paul's sermon in the chapter 2, verse 24 of the book of Acts, Peter is out there very boldly preaching Jesus to the Jews. And he does it by saying, "You have crucified Jesus, and God raised him from the dead." So Peter's testimony also affirms that of not only the Gospels, but of Paul and of the church creed. In addition to this, we also have the historians Clement and Polycarp, who are very influential in the early era. They worked closely with early disciples, and they actually taught and wrote down that they basically credited the zeal that the disciples showed in preaching the gospel to people was largely fueled by the resurrection of Jesus, because these men truly believed that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, and that they saw him, and that they ate dinner with him, and they saw him ascend into heaven as accounted in Acts. Number 2, second evidence. The Gospels of both Mark and Luke, when they tell about the resurrection of Jesus, when the empty tomb is discovered, when they find out that Jesus' body is no longer there, who do they both use as the first witnesses that Jesus is gone? Women. 2 women. Mary's one of them. While we don't think a whole lot about that in our day, in this ancient time, it's a very, very patriarchal society, and the testimony of a woman would have been worthless. It would have been meaningless. And so if these men were trying to write a gospel that was trying to sell something that didn't truly happen, they would not have used women as the first witnesses. They would have used probably some kind of an influential man. in order to influence the people. So that is an apologetic in itself, because that is not what you would typically do if you were making this story up. Number three, many of the witnesses, the disciples included, to name a couple, James, Paul, Peter, and Stephen, they all boldly proclaimed and preached Jesus Christ to people. And part of what they preached was the death and the resurrection of Christ. And these men boldly preached this to the death. They were actually martyred for their faith because they would not stop preaching that Jesus rose from the dead. Now think about this. If we got 12 people together and we came up with a lie and we're like, okay, I'm going to sell this to these people. We're going to make them believe this. We're all going to stick together and affirm this and our testimony. We're all going to back it, and we're going to convince them that it's real. When we go out and we start teaching them and telling them this stuff that's not true, once they started snatching up a couple of us and threatening to kill us in a brutal way, such as crucifixion, don't you think that story would fall apart pretty quick? But that's not what we see here. Even when faced with these brutal deaths, the disciples continue to preach Jesus, preach the resurrection, and they refuse to recant their story because it has to be real. They would not have died in this way for something that didn't happen, that they didn't see with their own eyes. Number four, this is actually not really an evidence, but it is disproving one method that some people use to attack the resurrection and say that it's not true. And that is the hallucination theory, that the disciples and the witnesses actually were hallucinating when they claimed to see Jesus. And some people even say that because of the trauma that they went through with this whole thing, that it was some kind of a hallucination that they experienced after the fact, and that it didn't really happen. And that while they wrote it down and while they went out and preaching that they saw this and were good intentioned, even possibly, they didn't really see it. It was just a hallucination. This is easily disproven because hallucinations don't happen in groups of people. Typically, a hallucination happens with one person at a time, and it's not a group of people. So we can rule that out. And number five, all the Roman leaders had to do and the Jewish leaders had to do in order to squash the belief of the early church in the resurrection of Christ, and to completely just put a stop to this Christian faith that was taken off in the Roman Empire, is produce the body of Jesus Christ. That's all they had to do. They crucified him. They knew he was dead when they took him off the cross, and then he was put in a tomb which they put guards outside of. So they knew where his body was. They had guards sitting outside of it to ensure that nobody could steal it and claim that he would be resurrected, because Jesus himself had basically predicted that he would be resurrected. And yet it still happens. But once the disciples go out and start boldly proclaiming and claiming that Jesus rose from the dead, all they would have had to do is produce the body of Jesus. But they couldn't. They couldn't do that, and they didn't even try to. Instead of doing this, they tried to use other methods, just such as, telling the guards that they wouldn't harm their families if they claimed the disciples stole the body. That's actually in Scripture. So instead of taking the easy way out, which would have immediately crushed the Christian faith by producing that body, they didn't. They tried other methods to try to explain it away, which obviously didn't work. The disciples continued to preach boldly, even until they faced martyrdom by crucifixion or whatever method it was. But these are all five evidences that we can believe that the resurrection really happened. And this is not an all-inclusive list. There's a lot more out there. There's a lot of other stuff, but we just don't have enough in a 5 or 10 minute video. But if you like these videos, please like the channel, subscribe, and share this with your friends. If you have any topics you want me to cover, send me a message. My email is in the description below. I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear feedback about what you think. But until the next one, I love you guys. Blessings.